Welcome, everyone. I see we have people joining. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. All right. Well, let me get us started here. So welcome to this digital conversation. My name is Mathieu Poirier. I'm an assistant professor with the School of Global Health at York University, the director of the Global Strategy Lab and York Research Chair in Global Health Equity. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this conversation. We're going to be talking about a newly published paper in BMJ Global Health titled Learning from the Montreal Protocol to Improve the Global Governance of Antimicrobial Resistance, which I'm sure we'll be commonly referring to as AMR throughout this conversation. And I'll just guide you briefly through the format of what to expect and then go into the quick introduction of our panelists today. We're going to have a quick presentation about the paper itself, go into about 20 to 30 minutes of questions for our panelists, and then we will be opening up questions to all of you, and we'll try to address as many as possible that we have time for. So I will encourage you to, as you're listening to the presentation and the conversation we're going to have, to please submit your questions using the Q&A function. Again, we'll try to address as many as possible live, but we'll also have some of the co-authors of the paper addressing them in written form via the Q&A. So again, please submit as many as you'd like. And to make this a bit more of an interactive conversation, I will also invite everyone here to please introduce yourself in the chat where you're based, your work, anything that you'd like. Please feel free to introduce yourself as we get started here. And with those details out of the way, I will start to introduce some of our panelists today, starting with Dr. Tina Nyangwe Moyo, who is an investigator with the Global Strategy Lab in the Global Legal Epidemiology Research Program. She has expertise in advanced demographic and epidemiologic research methods and is a lead author of the publication that we'll be speaking about today, Learning from the Montreal Protocol to Improve the Global Governance of AMR. We are also very pleased to be joined by Lucy Carpenter, who is a professor of atmospheric chemistry and a deputy head of the chemistry department at the University of York. Additionally, she's co-chair of the scientific assessment panel of the Montreal Protocol and lead chapter author of the 2014 and 2018 WMO UNEP scientific assessments of ozone depletion. And lastly, we are joined by Amit Khurana, who is the director of the Sustainable Food Systems Program at the Center for Science and Environment based in India, where he's been leading and guiding the center's campaign on animal and environmental dimensions of AMR for over a decade. So it's going to make for a fantastic conversation, many different sectors involved. I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Nyangwe Moyo to start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for that introduction. I want to thank everyone for making time for this presentation and to participate in this important discussion. So just so I get everyone on board, I want to preface my presentation with a couple of questions, and feel free to post your answers in the chat. So when we think about the greatest achievements of global health policies, what comes to mind? Is it immunization or the eradication of smallpox, or maybe most recently COVID-19 vaccines? I'll be happy to read your questions in the chat. But really, how many of us consider the Montreal Protocol or environmental agreements to be very important to our health and survival today? The Montreal Protocol is a rare example that we use in our study of global cooperation that worked really well by saving millions of lives from skin cancer deaths and also protecting us all from the harmful ultraviolet radiation. So I'll walk you through our study. So what really is the Montreal Protocol? The Montreal Protocol was signed actually in 1987. Was signed in 1987 and actually came into effect in 1989. So it was specifically meant to tackle specific and a serious environmental problem, which was ozone depletion. And this was caused by harmful chemicals like chlorofluorocarbons that were emitted in the atmosphere. So these chemicals were widely in use in everyday items, for example, refrigeration to aerosol sprays. And the use of these products really posed a hidden danger to the ozone layer, which really shields us and the Earth from harmful ultraviolet rays. So the establishment of the protocol led to the worldwide commitment by governments, by industries to phase out these chemicals using measurable targets, and most of which have been successfully met. So as a result, the protocol is now considered one of the most effective international environmental treaties in history because of its rapid results, universal adoption, and also rigorous accountability systems. So, and in terms of relevance, although ozone depletion and AMR are different challenges in many aspects, of course, we see that these two have clear parallels that we can easily draw between them. And the first is that they are both global health threats that share a nature as invisible crisis. And just as the dangers of chlorofluorocarbons, for example, were largely invisible, we couldn't see them. AMR also isn't something that we can see, but it's eroding our ability to treat infections and also protect human health. And secondly, both are global collective problems that require many actors to work together. And this is really a very important aspect about AMR. So based on these parallels that we draw, the aim of our study was to uncover the core principles that made the Montreal Protocol successful, but also to explore how we might be able to translate these core principles to best inform AMR governance. So in terms of methodology, we used a snowball approach to search for relevant literature and the 3I policy framework to analyze the ideas, the institutions, and also interests that were involved in the designing and implementation of the protocol. So our study establishes that the Montreal Protocol's success is actually rooted in 9 governance principles that we inductively categorize under 3 themes, and that is equity, flexibility, and accountability. And momentarily, you see how each of these principles did play a very unique role in the protocol. So let's begin with equity provisions. So these were really important in addressing disparities in resources and capacities to develop and developing countries' ability to implement the protocol obligations. And we see that specifically the protocol incorporated an inclusive approach that brought together diverse countries with varying economic statuses and interest to the negotiating table. And they also ensured that each voice at this negotiating table was heard. A multilateral fund was also established to support research and development of ozone-friendly chemicals that would replace the ozone-depleting substances, and as well as provide support that was needed for developing countries to implement their obligations. Another principle was that the protocol made preferential provisions for developing countries in terms of extended timelines that help them to remain compliant. And so when we translate these equity-themed principles to AMR, we see that the inclusion of equity measures will be elemental to AMR because AMR disproportionately impacts, for example, low and middle-income countries. And this also means that addressing AMR will require us to recognize global inequities that persist and also to prioritize support where the need is greatest. And in this context, it might mean creating policies that account for differentiated responsibility. And under flexibility, we observe that the protocol's flexible nature allowed it to adapt to new science, as ozone depletion information became available. And this was also essential in setting it up for long-term success. And some of the key principles that we garner under this theme include country-specific policy, country-specific strategies, which allowed each of the state parties to design their own processes and structures for phasing out ozone depleting substances. And these were based on their local context and also needs. And currently, we see this approach actually in the form of national action plans being already assimilated or integrated in the current AMR strategy, which is a good thing. The other principle that we see is innovation around incentive structures that we use to persuade industry to shift production toward environmentally friendly technologies. And the other was the inclusion of provisions that help the protocol to regularly amend its policies in response to evolving scientific evidence and also technological advancements. In terms of AMR, this lesson means that AMR governance strategy will need to be adaptable to allow for continuous improvement, but also to enhance its ability to respond to emerging threats as we have seen. And key innovations here really should center around building incentive structures that can stimulate innovation for pharmaceutical industries to develop new strains of antibiotics, but also to encourage investments in antimicrobial stewardship. We also implore on the AMR framework negotiators to adopt a similar system for regularly updating policy provisions as resistant patterns change and new information becomes available, because that's what is important in getting an effective policy. So accountability strategies were enforced through principles such as mass mobilization of the public to ramp up pressure for action against ozone depletion. And the other was the setting up of clear measurable targets. These targets really pertain to each of the state parties and made it easier for them to follow through as they went on to the implementation. The third was the establishment of independent external assessment panels, and these consisted of experts from around the world who were mandated to monitor progress and also provide recommendations based on the base science. And in all, we see that accountability mechanisms were critical in ensuring that state parties were able to report on their progress, they received the required support, and also remained compliant. So in the realm of accountability, if we want to really come up with sustainable solutions for AMR, these will really have to be trackable, they will need to be measurable, and also very transparent. And this would only be possible really if we're able to build a formidable advocacy coalition that is going to drive stronger policy commitments, but also to raise awareness, especially on the responsible use of antibiotics. And another important innovation here would be the institution of independent assessment panels. We know there's already proposals for an independent panel on evidence for action against AMR, but this has to be established as soon as possible, because these initiatives could really help to provide unbiased assessments for AMR global efforts. And so all this said, we acknowledge that while the Montreal Protocol does provide valuable insights, AMR also presents very unique challenges. And firstly, the AMR itself is very complex. If we look at the way resistant microbes evolve and also how they spread, the space is actually very unpredictable. And we're also looking at a multiplicity of stakeholders in AMR, including agriculture, human health, and pharmaceutical industries. So this all makes it quite intricate, for example, to set up meaningful targets and timelines as we see in the Montreal Protocol. And secondly, the greater needs for funding. AMR containment actually is a resource intensive venture, and higher financial needs than those that we've seen in the Montreal Protocol are required for us to really take off with an effective framework. So this all means that we need a lot of innovation around initiatives that we're going to come up with. So as I conclude, I just want to leave this important fact with you, saying that the Montreal Protocol may not be a one-size-fits-all model, but it is an incredible global governance success story, which we should all be learning from to advance our efforts in containing AMR. And our study that I'm just sharing here identifies concrete strategies that we can apply adaptively to help us on this journey. I thank you all for listening in.
Oh, thank you very much for that great presentation. And I'll just add that you could probably tell there's a wealth of different takeaways and ideas that are contained in this paper. And even though it's a quite short analysis piece, there's a lot there to read into. So I do encourage you to click on the links that are in the chat. There's the full paper as well as the policy brief after the webinar is over. And please take a closer look. But now I'd like to bring this conversation to the panel and start this conversation. So starting with Professor Carpenter, a question for you as co-chair of the Scientific Assessment Panel of the Montreal Protocol and lead chapter author of 2014-2018 WMO UNEP Scientific Assessment of Ozone Depletion. You've had a firsthand view into the continuing work that's guided by the Montreal Protocol. Can you please give us an idea of what these scientific and intergovernmental processes look like from the inside?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, Tina, as well, who I think has given a really insightful view of what's made the Montreal Protocol successful. So I've only recently started as a co-chair of the Scientific Assessment Panel. This is still very much a learning curve for me on the intergovernmental side. I've been involved on the scientific side, as you've said, for a number of years. So I'll talk about the scientific side first, and then a little bit on my more recent reflections on the kind of wider side and how the meetings of the parties are involved and how the sort of countries put across their interest through consensus. So the Scientific Assessment Panel is only one panel that advises the Montreal Protocol, as you may know. So there's us, the SAP. There's also the Technical and Economic Assessments Panel, and then there's the Environmental Assessments Panel as well. So the three of us, these different panels work together and advise on different aspects. The SAP, the ozone assessment, is produced every 4 years. And if you're a scientist involved in that, you're going to spend probably 2 years of your life working on that. So although it's produced every 4 years, there's 2 years of intense effort, I would say, every 4 years. From the inside, it's a very intense, carefully thought out collaborative process that involves scientists from across the world. There's an intention and an effort to make it geographically diverse and bring in a wider range of scientists as possible from different stages of career as well as different countries. First of all, what I would say is the parties themselves, to some extent, choose the topics of the assessment. So they put forward a list which has been revised over several of their meetings and put that forward. So we have a kind of starter for 10. We know the issues that they really want to be advised on. But of course, we bring forward new evidence and new issues that might come up as well. Essentially, the assessments incorporate new knowledge from existing observations, as well as modelling studies, an analysis with the whole aim to reflect how the latest scientific understanding of how human activity affects the ozone layer. And the Montreal Protocol, as Tina mentioned, has been flexible and has been amended many, many times. It now includes climate through the Kigali Amendment. That was put forward in 2016 and now, is being ratified by many countries. So that was a really big step in recognizing that the gases that were first produced, things like CFCs that depleted ozone, well, the replacements of those had unintended consequences and that they were really strong greenhouse gases. So the protocol had to evolve to take those into account as well. So I think from a scientific point of view, it's the scientists involved it's a reasonably small community, the stratospheric ozone community, partly because the science of it, has been reasonably well explained already. Now, there are new things that come up, especially in stratospheric dynamics, and of course, how all these chemicals are evolving. But certainly, if I look at atmospheric science funding overall, not a huge amount of it goes into stratospheric ozone depletion. So we tend to be quite a small community of scientists. Once you've been involved, you can never really leave, and you'll get asked to do it again. And so it's good to know the community around you. So I mean, from my point of view, the scientists involved really are so excited to do something that really matters. As as Tina mentioned, this is considered to be, the world's most successful environmental protection. So everyone's excited to be involved. Everyone wants this to be the best that they can. And that's really on our side, that people can see how well this has worked, and that engenders more people to want to be involved. Because it is hard work, and these meetings are very stressful. And I have never been to an IPCC meeting, but I hear that there are similarities, and that we thrash out word for word the assessment reports, particularly the executive summaries, which we know, certainly the parties will read the executive summaries, even if they don't read every single word of every single chapter. So those words in the executive summary are done in plenary at the end or towards the end of that 2-year process. Once you've been already through several drafts of your chapters and you've had reviewers' comments, then you might think you've done a good job. Then you see it up there on the screen, and you realize that there are perhaps a few holes in your argument. So doing it as a consensus scientifically is really important. And as I said, there are a range of different representation in that, not only from academia, but there are some industry people on there and people from the other panels as well. So we have insights from the technical assessment panel and from the environmental assessment panel. So I guess that's just like an insight what it's like to be involved as a scientist. We always say, those of us that have been chapter lead authors, by the end of those 2 years, you're going to have spent more time with your author than you've done with your partner or your children. So you better like them. You generally end up quite close friends with them. So that's the science perspective. So I'm a new co-chair of the SAP, and I've only just been to my very first meeting of the parties, which was 2 weeks ago in Bangkok at the UN, and that was absolutely fascinating. So it's where the draft decisions regarding potential changes to the amendment, or just information that they have asked the different panels to bring forward next time, or even slight changes in how the reporting is done, which Tina touched upon a little bit, because the governance of this, obviously, and the reporting is really important. So you get to see there, every country in the world, of course. So there is those things that Tina mentioned about everybody having a voice is really important. You can start to see sort of some alliances potentially going on between different arguments. As scientists, our role there is the meeting of the parties. It's not our meeting. So we keep quiet. We're there to advise, and if we get asked to advise, then we do. There's a presentation that we make that is invited on a specific issue. So the parties will tell us what issue they want us to present on, and then they can just go for us. So, you know, if the language is really important to try, of course, to be neutral. I mean, sometimes, and you may have heard of the issue of CFC 11, sometimes there are gases that are monitored that we realize aren't following the route expected under full Montreal Protocol controls. And that's where things do start to become tricky, when you realize that things are not going as expected. So, you know, I've now seen at firsthand how the meeting of the parties goes, and it's really interesting, having gone from one side to seeing the other side, and realizing that the issues that the parties have are quite different to us as scientists. You know, as scientists, when we write these reports, we sometimes get overexcited and want to essentially write a review of the subject, which is not useful. You know, you want to keep it focused on the issues that you know are important to them. So I think, you know, having that perspective from both sides is really interesting. So, I mean, I guess I will stop there, because I've just gone on a little bit, but if there's anything else that you wanted to ask me, then please do.
Yeah, you know, I've certainly got a follow-up after we go to the other panelists, but great to hear that the scientific community at least is so supportive after all these years, because in the AMR community, we are hoping we'll have the opportunity to do similar work. So great to hear the behind-the-scenes perspective. Let me now turn to Professor Kurana. So your work is focused on ensuring that global conversations on AMR incorporate animal and environmental health, as well as the needs of resource-constrained settings of the Global South. What equity-promoting learnings from the Montreal Protocol do you think can be used to improve the global governance of AMR?
Okay, thank you, Matthew, for this interesting question. Before I actually jump on to the key aspects of it, let me just very quickly congratulate the team. I think this is a good work. It clearly identifies what could be the lessons and what were the good things in the Montreal Protocol. And I also want to acknowledge that, yes, that was the first time perhaps when science and scientific community came together to inform the policymakers. Industry, though, took time, but it eventually came up with alternatives. Public advocacy groups also came together. They were successful. They could do what they wanted to do. And the governments eventually came together for something like for an environmental issue. But at the same time, it is also important to remember, keep in mind that the degree of complexity between, let's say, the issue of CFC is depleting ozone versus AMR is very different. And some might as well disagree, but yes, people who are working on AMR at this point in time, like me, who have not worked on that particular issue, feel that this is a complex issue. And when it comes to the fact that here AMR is largely a health issue, and the issue of Montreal Protocol was largely an environmental issue, one really feels that perhaps we have become much more insensitive. The world has become much more, I would say, thick-skinned, that a health issue is not really addressed, and we were actually able to address an environmental issue 40, 50 years ago in a very successful way. Now, because of these differences, let's say, the level of complexity, clearly it is collectively impacting the science, the public perception, the awareness, the industry action, if I may say, the action on the ground, the commitments. And all this, in my view, is therefore impacting, let's say, some of the principles and some of the themes that you have captured in your paper, for example, equity. Now, when I come to equity part, I mean, the paper clearly mentions some of the very important learnings. I mean, clearly it's about inclusive negotiations. Yes, we need those in AMR as well. Multilateral funding, yes, we need those in AMR as well. Progressive compliance model, yes, that would also be very useful. But the point here is that we are not there yet. We are actually on the way. Now, when we are on the way, what is important? It's important to then keep in mind certain prerequisites that will help us be there the way we want to be. And I've captured something. For example, if we are trying about inclusive negotiations, then what do we need to do? From my experience of, let's say, over a decade and a half, I can tell you that we need to keep a check on the narrative. with respect to LMICs. Are LMICs the problem, big problem, or they are going to be impacted heavily, or it's the both? This matters. A clarity on this matters. And what about the rich parts of the world? Where are they with reference to the scale of the problem and solution? I think the balance is missing. My second point is, are LMICs adequately represented in forums wherein the decisions are made about them and they are not there? I think we need to be mindful of that. And once we do that, it'll impact the equity part. Because if we don't do that, the chances of getting wrong are perhaps higher, even in some cases far from reality. And then, of course, the ownership of the LMICs would not come. It would always remain a concern. To be honest, it will put them on defensive. Third important point is that whatever solutions are proposed in, let's say, these forums, they got to be really aimed to help LMICs and not really target them, particularly with reference to data or evidence that is building, and the interpretation of those data should actually be, there has to be a balance around the perception within the LMICs will matter, the action in the LMICs. So that's first part in terms of inclusive negotiations. Now, let me come back to the second part, multilateral funding. Yes, very much needed. We all know that. But we also know that despite 10 years of global action plan and second political declaration, progress is limited so far, right? But what is important here? It's the sustainability in funding. It should be for the long term, not just a project-centric funding. Important is the flexibility in this funding is also important. It should actually aim to address a local problem and not just driven by agendas or aims of any other agencies or geographies. And of course, it should not focus on something which is too much expensive and have a cost-effective approach to the entire, for it to be holistic, for it to be long-term. Now, what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that it is not just about the quantity of the funding, but it is also about the quality of the funding. Now, the third part, let's say progressive compliance model. Yes, we need flexibility. We need, it will be about delayed start in some countries. It will be about different sets of timelines, different targets in some countries. And the idea of common but differentiated targets is rooted in local context is what matters. That will be most critical. But here too, there are challenges. For example, what to really comply for? I mean, it lacks clarity in certain cases. I mean, what does meaningful reduction means in the latest political declaration vis-a-vis antibiotic use in agri-food sectors? What does that mean? We know that yes, on the human health side, 10% mortality reduction is there. But what about the environment, let's say? So you need some kind of clarity on, in fact, I would say a great deal of clarity on what to comply with. And we also know baseline is missing, both at the national level and at the global level. What indicators really would be most useful, for example, is also a challenge. Is it just bacteria? Is it just total use of antibiotics? Or is it individual antibiotics? Because 500 milligrams of one antibiotic may be actually about one gram of another antibiotic. So when we say total weight, how do we address these technical questions? And why should I comply? I here meaning any country should comply. That message or that perception, both at the national level and in some case, let me say at the national level, is not as strong as you see in, let's say, a situation where we're talking about climate change. I know that nations have much stronger perception about, yes, we need to act on the climate change, but on AMR, it's not the case. So the question of compliance model actually has a lot of gaps, and all this actually is critical for something like a protocol or, let's say, a legally binding instrument. Unless you have that level of clarity, that will be very, very. So with that, I stop here, if that helps.
No, thank you so much for that intervention and the challenge, really, to take these high-level principles and make them concrete, make them real with the challenges that we're facing, and there are many of them. There's the next question I have for Dr. Nyangwe is actually quite related to this, and it's that we've seen flexibility was one of the keys to the Montreal Protocol success, allowing countries to adapt their strategies to local constraints and opportunities. So when we turn to AMR, what are some of the opportunities that could be considered for global governance in that space?
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I think my response really does build on what Emmett and Lucy were just highlighting. In that flexibility in the context of AMR really is very crucial because as we see in the Montreal Protocol, it does enable adaptation. And for AMR, it's a landscape that is fraught with significant variations in healthcare systems across countries that we are interested in, and antibiotic availability, and also fragmentation in regulatory standards, and also practices, for example, in agriculture. So all this really means that if we're going to implement policies that are going to be universal, for example, in regions where access to antibiotics is really limited, it could inadvertently harm healthcare access or even worsen existing health inequities. So, as Emmett said, I think this exemplifies the delicate balance that has to be struck for us to deliver an effective AMR framework. And this said, I think some of the opportunities that could be leveraged in this sense is like working with what we have right now in terms of contextual policy development. So we could use, for example, the national action plans that we already have, because there's a framework around that to begin maybe strengthening these processes and frameworks. Allowing for differentiated targets and timelines is actually very important because, for example, in low and middle income countries, especially low income countries that have limited healthcare access, it will be important for us to prioritize improving access to antibiotics and just building stewardship systems where people start to realize that taking antibiotics in this way is really not the way to go. For example, I think post-COVID, we see that in low-income countries, for example, I'll speak for Zambia, where I'm originally from, like people take antibiotics like azithromycin so liberally, like you could just go to a pharmacy and get it when you get a code because they think it works very well. And so that is a source of abuse. So you're abusing these antibiotics without recognizing that these are not drugs that we should be taking this way. So there's need for us to build these systems that are going to bring in like awareness in people in different communities. And once this is done, once these systems are built, I think the next important aspect will be empowering these countries to maybe then adopt regulatory approaches that gradually restrict the use of antibiotics. So there's the issue of access and also the issue of restricting how much are they taking too much or who is not actually having access to these life-changing treatments. So all these, I think, will be very important opportunities for us to begin with. But other than that, I think incentivizing innovation through public-private partnerships is a very important pathway in leveraging opportunities that lie within this environment of AMR. And we see that in the Montreal Protocol, industry buy-in was encouraged through incentives that helped these industries to develop alternative technologies. So in the sense of AMR, I think we also need opportunities to offer incentives to fund viable research in alternative treatments and also diagnostic tools. I think we have a very good example right now of the Longitude Prize, which is the UK-based scientific challenge initiative that offers incentives in the development to teams that are developing cutting-edge and rapid diagnostic tools. And this is very good because I think a few teams and biotech labs have benefited from this, but we need all such initiatives to be expanded. we could also think about country-to-country collaborations. For example, in the Montreal Protocol, we see how Japan helped countries like Thailand and Indonesia to speed up their implementation of their obligations in the protocol. So such kinds of alliances could be built and encouraged for the AMR, and it could begin with country to country, and also maybe regional alliances. All these, I think, are great initiatives that the AMR leadership and also community could leverage, and I think that is the way we should go.
Thank you so much for all of those different opportunities. So clearly there's much that can be done to address AMR across all of these different levels. And as I turn back to Professor Carpenter, I will encourage everyone to please submit your questions through the Q&A if you'd like them answered. So turning to Professor Carpenter, we know that accountability mechanisms were key for tracking countries' progress, for encouraging compliance, promoting global cooperation, and also maintaining the protocol's credibility. In your experience, how can we leverage science to keep countries accountable to their international commitments?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I actually wrote some things down, but then listening to Tina and Amit, I've kind of thrown that away, coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I think there's a few things to say that. I mean, first of all, I guess there's maybe a perception. I mean, I must admit, I do not know much about AMR, so apologies if what I'm saying just sounds very obvious to you, and it probably does some of it. But first of all, from the Montreal Protocol perspective, maybe it's slightly more complex than people would initially think. So, for example, the controls on the Montreal Protocol are clearly around production and consumption of chemicals. And that data is reported to the UNEP Ozone Secretariat. We have access to that, but we don't have as much granular data as we would like. So, for example, to protect consumer interests, there has to be a certain number of companies or a certain number of countries that report that data. We can't necessarily go and publish data from one country by itself. So that does introduce some complexity. And then when we come to monitor it as scientists, we're basically inferring the emissions from either globally or by country from atmospheric measurements. That's not a direct measure of the emissions. We have to, through computer modeling, turn our atmospheric observations into emissions. That relies on having a sufficient global network, and we're often actually quite blind to the places where we would really like to measure, where we know that there is a lot of production going on and maybe some leakage and maybe some issues. And so all those things do lead to quite a lot of complexity in how, as scientists, we can, advise what's going on. And we have to be really, really sure of what we're saying. So there is always that tension of an early warning system, or really making sure that the numbers that we're providing are absolutely correct. I mean, for example, in the case of turning concentrations into emissions and looking at trends and variability, we have to make sure we've accounted for other sources of variability as well. So there are all those complex issues involved. I just want to touch on, I think Amit mentioned baseline, and I'm not sure what your baseline is for AMR, but there is an adopted baseline, obviously in the Montreal Protocol, scientifically, in terms of how stratospheric chlorine and bromine are evolving with time. The baseline is not perfect, and we have a lot of scientific discussions about that, but even though it's not perfect, we have adopted it. And I think, it's important to get the community behind something that might not be perfect, but is workable and is something that the parties do understand. And you can't go changing it 20 years down the line when it's always been the baseline. So clearly getting a really good understanding of that early on is really important. And then I wanted to touch on something that we have done as well in the Montreal Protocol community, is think about, and this was, I think, mentioned by both Tina and Amit, we've done what's called world avoided scenarios. So what would have happened with no Montreal Protocol? And, of course, you can't look into your crystal ball and say what would have happened, but you can make scenarios, for example, based on, 3% increase or some GDP scenario. And then you can say, well, this is what would have happened to the ozone layer. This is what would have happened to the chemicals. And, you know, we would have had twice as much UV by mid-century. And those kind of messages are very strong. They might not be, it's very hard to say how factually accurate they are, because of course there is no such thing as a future that didn't happen, but they've turned out to be a powerful message to underline the success of the Montreal Protocol. And then I think the final, I mean, this is not maybe answering your question really perfectly, but I think what's always also been mentioned is long-term funding, which is so important and a real struggle because, you know, we've had to have these baselines and these measurements have been going back decades. They've relied mostly on two US institutions, NASA and also NOAA. There aren't many similar or any similar institutions. So those two institutions underpin much of the monitoring that has gone on. And so, you know, providing that long-term home is exceptionally important, and we wouldn't have been able to do what we've done without those observations. So I'm sorry if I haven't quite answered your question, but I'm more kind of reflecting and reacting on the other two panelists, which made some really good points. So I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic, and that behind the scenes view into what actually happens in these scientific conversations and the idea of the counterfactuals. I think we might actually take you up on translating that idea to AMR. So thank you. Let me turn again to Professor Khurana with a question that some of the proposed accountability mechanisms for AMR have included establishing an independent panel for evidence for action against AMR, global unifying goals, and nationally determined targets. What do you think we can take away from this conversation, from the protocol, as we consider accountability mechanisms and incentivizing countries to follow through on their commitments?
Thank you. Thank you for this question, Matthew. So I would say here too, the case for accountability is not appropriately or adequately set. I mean, global unifying goals, for example, we know they are not set for, they're just set for, let's say, 10% mortality in humans, but none for the animal sector or none for the environmental dimensions. Now, national determined targets, we know countries are not prepared yet. So, and regarding the independent panel, let's say, which is considered very important, the work is in progress, yes, but is yet to happen. We do not know when it will happen. So clearly the case is not adequately, in my view, appropriately set. The second part of the challenge here is that we again need more clarity, let's say, and remove the confusion. For example, let's say, where does the Muscat Manifesto commitments, let's say, stand now, wherein we have about 47 countries committed to let's say, 30 to 50% reduction of antibiotic use in the agri-food systems. Now, where does that stands now after having this political declaration? How would I mean, we know that ministerial meeting is happening at Jeddah today and tomorrow. So how would that now, the new discussions will come into picture? How would they do? I mean, this is like saying every year we make a lot of new commitments, and then how do we have to be very clear. I mean, how they move, how they build on each other, and so that there's no confusion. The technical part of this confusion is, as I said earlier, what does meaningful reduction mean? But I'm particularly astonished by the fact that the prophylactic and metaphylactic use, let's say, Europe, we all know, EU has banned it for let's say, a couple of years now. So clearly the narrative, I mean, there's one set of so many countries decided that this is not good, this needs to be phased out, and they've banned it. But we don't see that language or that narrative in the political declaration of the UNGA this time. So it's one thing to say the narrative could have been, yes, we have addressed it. It's best avoided. We know that it's difficult in your settings, but let's start towards it. But the current narrative is, we have addressed it, but it's okay to keep doing it. So, and let's address it later on, something like that. Now, that confusion, in a way, again, if you do not know what is the ask, the problem is, what are you going to be accountable for? Now, critical important antimicrobials, for example, we do not know till date where does the global consensus around which antibiotics should actually, or let's say which highest priority critical important antibiotics should not be used in the animals, other than one or two where the global community has come together. So what I'm trying to again say here is that yes, we are on the way. We have not reached there yet. Things look very different in the hindsight because now the Montreal Protocol has delivered in many ways. It's a very successful. The journey is going on the MR side. But unless we have a lot of clarity on these many issues, with equity as well as accountability, both will struggle. So that's what I'm trying to say. Okay.
No, that's fantastic. And pointing to maybe some missed opportunities and the fact that this work very much continues. We are getting towards the end of our time together, but I want to make sure to get to one last question that I'm hoping that all three of you can weigh in on. And I will start with Dr. Nyangwe. And that's the role of public advocacy, which I think we've seen in the paper played a really crucial role in driving progress towards the adoption, but also compliance with Montreal Protocol, bringing in the public into this conversation. So a couple related questions. One, in the case of ozone depleting substances, how is public engagement continuing to be mobilized? And in the case of AMR, how can we mobilize public support and advocacy to accelerate global action? Again, starting with Dr. Nyangwe, and then maybe going to Professor Carpenter, and then Dr. Kurana.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthew. I think when it comes to advocacy, I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's very, very crucial. And for AMR, I think we should be elevating public advocacy to really bring understanding and also to influence behavior change. Because I think even more important, I think for AMR, behavior change is one of the things or aspects that are quite different from the Montreal Protocol and how it was delivered. We need a lot of that. So there's many layers of behavior change that we need. For example, in healthcare practices, in the habits in which antibiotics are prescribed, but also in how people take antibiotics and their understanding of the adverse effects that comes with antibiotic use, misuse, or overuse. So I think these are some of the ideas and aspects where we need to focus our public advocacy on. And beyond that, I think, as Lucy mentioned earlier, we need a lot of data around antibiotic misuse or resistance itself, so that people get to understand exactly how this thing works. I think we see that there's not so much interest into AMR because there's little that people understand. So I think this is one inroad that we could really capitalize on. And also we could think there are so many other avenues that could be used. For example, there is the WHO Antibiotic Awareness Week. So these could really be used as platforms where we can bring in education for both the public and healthcare providers about the responsible use of antibiotics. I think in the sense of time, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Sorry, do you want me to go next, Matthew, or?
Yes, if you could, please.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, what I would say is probably, as certainly the rest of the panelists know, that public advocacy has been so important in the Montreal Protocol all the way along. And the public, got behind this precautionary principle of what would have happened or what could happen if we'd continued with these emissions. So that's really important. What I would say is that, and I'd be very remiss as a new co-chair if I didn't mention the fact that we spend quite a lot of effort on every 4-year assessment, producing what we call the 20 questions and answers. So these are aimed at the public, and this is not something that just somebody does on an afternoon. There is many, many days, weeks, months of effort put into updating what what we consider to be the main public concerns about ozone layer protection. So although those questions some of them have remained similar or the same over years. They do tend to change as well slightly. And important thing is that, the graphics on those are amazing. So as scientists, we can all use those 20 questions and answers as resources to do our own public advocacy, whether that's in schools or in conferences or whatever. But we have like a set, somewhere to go where we know we've got the best up-to-date and, pretty and, graphically very inspiring messages with which to hopefully make the message understandable and make it clear and bring home both what would have happened and the importance of the protocol. So yeah, there's a lot of effort spent on those presentational tools.
Okay, so it's my turn. Well, I would say the answer lies, of course, in awareness. And we know that it's about awareness with the people, awareness of the communities, let's say, right? Stakeholders, media, alternative media. And it's also about awareness on problems, solutions, cost, and the patient stories. But what is clear is that the threat perception is low. Or the threat perception is high. There are really some bigger problems at the national level. Or everything is fine, but the resources are constrained. So it could be one or more, it could be all. Now, but over the last so many years, what is very clear is that the global community has not been able to come up with a real strong case for the need for change, if I may say. A strong case that, yes, alternative exists. Why would farmers move if there is no alternatives? A strong case that food systems can be transferred. It is possible to be productive without chemical use. That's that. Unless we do that, it'll not sell with the farmers or the producers. A strong case that trade and livelihood and the economy is not going to be impacted in the long run. It may get some dent in the short term, but not in the long run. A strong case that the cost of inaction is much higher than the cost of action. Returns on investments are much higher. Only then it'll sell with the policymaker. But yes, awareness about all these is important. What is also important is give easy wins and prioritize. With that, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent way to wrap up. And I want to thank all of the panelists for a really rich conversation between sectors, so many different perspectives and ideas. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And in the last minute that I have left, I would also like to ask the participants to please complete an evaluation form that will be put into the chat right now, if you have time. And also to remind you that because World AMR Awareness Week is coming up, we will also have 2 more webinars that we're going to be giving as the Global Strategy Lab and AMR Policy Accelerator. And again, I believe we'll be dropping links in the chat about those webinars that are coming up as well. And right on time, I want to thank everyone for participating, for joining us. And I hope that you'll be able to join us for future events as well. Thanks, everyone.